A reading from the second letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, since we have this ministry, through the mercy shown us, we are not discouraged. Rather, we have renounced shameful, hidden things, not acting deceitfully or falsifying the word of God, but by the open declaration of the truth, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. For we do not preach ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for the sake of Jesus. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shown in our hearts to bring to light the knowledge of the glory of God on the face of Jesus Christ. But we hold this treasure in earthen vessels, that the surpassing power may be of God and not from us. Verbum Domini. Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to all the nations.
Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to all the nations.
Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all you lands. Sing to the Lord, bless his name.
Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to all the nations.
Announce his salvation day after day. Tell his glory among the nations, among all peoples his wondrous deeds.
Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to all the nations.
Give to the Lord, you families of nations. Give to the Lord glory and praise. Give to the Lord the glory due his name. Say among the nations, the Lord is king. He has made the world firm, not to be moved. He governs the peoples with equity.
Dominus vobiscum,
et cum spiritu tuo.
Lectio Sancti Evangelii secundum Lucam.
Gloria tibi, Domine.
An argument broke out among the apostles about which of them should be regarded as the greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are addressed as benefactors. But among you it shall not be so. Rather, let the greatest among you be as the youngest, and the leader as the servant. For who is greater, the one seated at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one seated at table? I am among you as one who serves. It is you who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer a kingdom on you, just as my Father has conferred one on me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. And you will sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Verbum Domini. Today is the feast of the great Saint Gregory. And he is the last of the Latin fathers of the church. A new period begins after him. But he becomes one of the most influential of the saints for the next few hundred years, for a number of reasons. First of all, we always have to take a look at somebody's life and how the various elements of his life helped him become who he was. For his life, he went through 4 basic stages. First, he was born to a very ancient and noble family in Rome. They lived in a villa, but it was a villa they maintained among the ruins of almost all the other villas and palaces. Not far from them had been the palaces of emperors. But it's important for us to remember that for more than 130 years before his birth, Rome had been devastated by one invasion of barbarians after another. The Visigoths, 130 years early in 410. Later the Vandals in 455. And finally, there were a series of wars in which one of the barbarians who had become a Roman general wrote to the emperor and says, we don't need an emperor in the West, we got it covered. And this is oftentimes seen as the collapse of the Western Empire. And Ostrogoths came in after him, and the Roman Empire tried to respond by fighting against the Ostrogoths. But they caused more devastation than the barbarians themselves had caused. And this was the kind of country he grew up in. And in fact, as he grew up, the fighting between the empire and the Ostrogoths finally ended, only to be replaced by the last barbarian group, the Lombards, who came in afterwards. This was a situation of chaos that had been going on in the empire for more than 225 years by the time he died. Can you imagine 225 years of ongoing invasions by one group after another? And yet, his family, which was very Catholic, very pious, not only was his great-great-grandfather a pope, but also 2 of his aunts were nuns that got canonized, and his own mother is still known as Saint Sylvia. He was raised in this very Catholic environment, but also a very Roman one. He learned a classical education. He studied music, art, as much science as he could, grammar, the Latin language. All of these types of normal studies were still present, but they were about to collapse. But he, as one of these wealthy noblemen, was able to receive that education, and by the time he was a young man, he was made the prefect of Rome, so the equivalent of a mayor. They didn't vote for him, of course, but he was made the mayor. And he ran this chaotic scene. He did this as part of his heritage as a Roman noble and doing what his father wanted him to do. And this was done very, very well and honestly. For the sake of the people, he was a politician who cared only for the people and not for his own ideas. But then once his father died, when he was in his early 30s, he decided to join the Benedictines. The Lombards had destroyed the only Benedictine monastery, which is at Monte Cassino, the monks fled to Rome. And he gave one of his family's villas to become a monastery, and he joined it as a fellow monk. He didn't become the abbot or anything. He wanted to be a novice. He wanted to go through the process of learning about this life of prayer and quiet. And this is what he dedicated himself to. Now, he made a little bit of a mistake. He fasted so much that he ended up being sick the rest of his life. So he had to learn to be moderate. That was one of the great advantages of the rule of Saint Benedict, to be more moderate. And he was imitating some of the heroes of Egypt that he'd read about. And the Benedictines taught him to be a little more sensible so that you can do this for the long run, as well as be fasting and abstaining and praying. And this period of an interior life, of coming to know Christ, seeing Christ, meeting him in the scriptures, in the liturgy of the hours, all of this encounter with Christ is what gave him a whole new perspective. His background as a Roman noble was good, a good human preparation, but Christ gave him a whole new perspective on everything, including the chaos going on around him. However, the Pope Pelagius II realized what a great talent this was, and he made him a deacon. Now, in these days, the deacons in Rome were the precursors of the cardinals, and almost, for the most part, popes were chosen from among the deacons. And this was the Pope's way of saying, let's see what this guy has, and maybe he'll end up my successor. So he was in charge of caring for the poor. Rome was devastated. Try to imagine, some of the cities that we see today devastated by the wars in Syria and Iraq. Think of Erbil and how it's filled with refugees, and he's trying to find a way to help them because the government became ineffective. It was not able to help. Only the church was around, and he was able to draw on his family's lands and have all of the food that was grown on their estates as being dedicated to care for the poor and the refugees. At that point, the Pope then said, I want you to be my Obicrasarius. This was the ambassador to the emperor in Constantinople. He did not like this. He didn't speak Greek. He knew Latin, but he was typical of people in the West. They no longer learned Greek as they had in the ancient days. So he was at a disadvantage, but he had, again, that background as a politician and as a Roman noble, but also he had that perspective as a monk. As he lived in the court of the emperor, he also was able to look at the way so many people in the church, so many priests and bishops and deacons, were trying to get close to the sources of political power in order to have advantage. Constantinople had not been invaded by the barbarians. It was extremely safe. It was extremely luxuriant and wealthy. And it was this marvelous court, the greatest court of the world at that time. And he looked at that not as, oh boy, we get to have all this fun. No, he could see, what is this wealth and power doing to the Christian lives of even the bishops and priests and deacons, as well as the lay people involved. And this also became extremely important perspective for him to look at this not as this is going to be the best thing, but rather to examine this through the eyes of Christ's gospel and evaluate what this all means in the long run. After about 5 years as Apocrisiarius, he was brought back to Rome and went back to the monastery where he was made the abbot. But once the Pope died during a plague, he was elected Pope. And he tried to avoid it. But it was not only the people, but the emperor said, no, I want you to be Pope. So he took on that role. And again, Rome was an even bigger chaos. There were more refugees, disease. Matter of fact, he led the people in praying, that the Lord would defend them from disease. And finally, he saw a vision of St. Michael the Archangel up above the tomb of the Emperor Hadrian. And to this day, it's still called Castel Sant'Angelo, because he had seen the holy angel of God above it, and that's when the plague ended. He continued his relief of the poor his whole life as Pope. But he also realized his primary purpose was to preach the gospel. So he did a series of commentaries. One was a commentary on all the gospels of the year. In those days, there was a one-year cycle, just as we had up to the Vatican Council. And he did it because he knew the priests could not go to school like he had been able to do. They were trying to survive barbarian invasions. Their towns, cities all over Europe were wiped out. Cities that once had lighted lamps, running water, sewers, were now the places where animals lived and were totally devastated, and people were trying to eke a living off in the woods as more barbarians kept coming with no one to stop them. So he wrote these sermons so that at least the priest would have something. If they couldn't do enough theology themselves, they could read his sermons. Then he did a series of sermons on the book of Ezekiel. Why Ezekiel? Ezekiel talked about the watchman, and that the pastor is a watchman looking out. And Gregory's name in Greek, Gregoron, means watchman. So he took that as himself, but also Ezekiel wrote when Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, was being devastated by the Babylonians. He could relate to the kind of political corruption going on. And he could help his people gain perspective that that devastation of Jerusalem eventually was overcome, and we can go forward. A lot of people were thinking back then, this is the end of the world. That was a common thought for about 150 years around his time. And he said, no, Jerusalem was rebuilt, and we have to go forward as if this is what we are dealing with. But he also knew that Christ is the judge of him first and of the rest of us. And therefore, we have to live through the devastation, live through the dangers, knowing that how we act in the face of it will be judged by Christ. And so he used that. He also wrote his great commentary on the book of Job to again give people a sense, how do we learn to live this Christian life, to be as good as Job in the midst of horrible suffering, such as Job experienced, innocent suffering for many. And yet we can still find in that a great source of strength that God can use even this chaos that they were living in. He also wrote a very extremely important book on how to be a pastor. And he wrote that there was a bishop who was mad at him because the Pope said, I don't want you to be a bishop. You won't be very good at it. You want power. You want this for your own name. And so he wrote in response to the bishop's complaints, He wrote this book on what it means to be a pastor. And this was so important that the Emperor Charlemagne had a copy sent to all the bishops a couple hundred years later. The Emperor Maurice of Constantinople had copies made, translations into Greek, sent to all of his bishops. In England, they translated into Old English and sent it to all of the bishops there, because it warns pastors. Jesus calls us to be good shepherds and feed his sheep. We cannot live in a way that is immoral ourselves, because we are like those shepherds who drink the pure water of Christ ourselves, and then we make the water dirty for everybody else by our bad examples. He warns them again and again. He understands the different kinds of people that there are and analyzes how you deal with each type of person. And that became one of the most important pastoral efforts for the next hundreds of years, translated into Old English all the way into the next millennium. But in addition to that, he had been in the imperial court. He learned from that. These politicians in the imperial government, this enormous bureaucracy and government where everybody is trying to make a living for themselves, and they don't care about the needs of the poor. They don't care about what's going on with the rest of the empire. And he realized that this large government cannot help us. There is no future with them. And in fact, the future is with the barbarians. And so then he is the one who unleashed the Benedictines on the barbarians. He sent St. Augustine, one of the monks from his monastery, St. Andrew's, that had been his villa. He sent him with about 30-some monks to go and evangelize in England. They were pagans. And he said, I don't want you only to teach the word. I want your example of a Christian community to be a live church, that they can see what it means to live as a Christian instead of as a barbarian. Be that example in the midst of the barbarity. And they were afraid. The French, the monks that they met on the way, said, don't go there, they'll kill you. And St. Augustine even went back to Rome and said, they're going to kill us. And St. Gregory said, go. And so they went, and they didn't kill them. They converted them. And they also then, from England, began to send monks along with the Irish all over Europe. And it was this unleash of spiritual power in the Benedictine order that he had once joined, that then became the force to convert barbarians all over Europe. And in fact, became the force that invented Europe out of the barbarians. This is something that we can never forget. We have terrible problems. We have a government that sometimes causes more problems than it solves. We see all sorts of immorality throughout our society, and barbarity being enacted in our own culture, not only from the barbarous nature of people that behead, people that are even non-combatants, beheading Christians and such, with ISIS and all these other groups, but we have a barbarity that we raise among ourselves, as we see in our streets with riots and such nonsense, the murder and all the rest. And it's not for us to say, oh, we have to flee. No, we go to Christ like he did. Gain the perspective of Jesus Christ as Gregory did. And then go to the barbarians as Gregory sent the Benedictines, so that we don't forsake them, but rather we too become good shepherds who go out to our world to bring them to Christ and transform their barbarity into a new Christian culture As much as the atheists will not resist us, we will stand all the more firm. And in this way, serve Christ and be good shepherds in our own world with its problems.